I thought my neighbor was just a friendly old man, but what I discovered about him changed everything. I live in a small, quiet town where everyone knows each other. It is the kind of place where people wave at you when you walk by, and you end up knowing way more about your neighbors than you ever really wanted to. I have lived here for 3 years, renting a modest one-bedroom apartment in an old converted house. My neighbor, Mr. Johnson, lived on the floor above me. He was an elderly man in his late 70s, with a head of thick white hair, always wearing suspenders over his button-down shirts. He was the kind of guy who gave off grandpa vibes, a sweet, quiet old man who mostly kept to himself. Mr. Johnson would always say hello to me when I passed by his door. He would sometimes invite me in for tea or small talk, but I never took him up on the offer. It felt unnecessary. He was just a neighbor. But whenever I saw him outside tending to his little flower garden or walking around town, he would always stop for a chat. He seemed like such a kind-hearted guy, someone who had probably lived in this town forever. About 6 months ago, things started to get strange. I began hearing noises coming from his apartment at odd hours. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, just subtle sounds, like footsteps or muffled talking, usually late at night or early in the morning. At first, I brushed it off as an old man probably moving around in his sleep or having the TV on. But it kept happening, and the noises started to feel off. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something crashing above me. It was loud, like furniture being knocked over. I sat up in bed, heart racing, wondering if something had happened to Mr. Johnson. I debated whether I should go check on him, but after a few minutes, the noise stopped, and everything was quiet again. I convinced myself that maybe it was just an accident, maybe he had tripped over something. Still, it left me uneasy. A few days later, I ran into him outside. He was smiling as usual, chatting about the weather and asking me how work was going. There was nothing unusual about him, no sign that anything had happened. But something about the way he looked at me that day sent a chill down my spine. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and I suddenly had the odd feeling that maybe I didn't know him as well as I thought. Over the next few weeks, the noises continued. I tried to ignore them, but it became harder to sleep at night. Then, one evening, I came home from work and noticed something strange in the hallway outside my apartment. There was a faint smell, something I couldn't quite place, like a mix of chemicals and something metallic. I followed the scent up the stairs to Mr. Johnson's door. My curiosity got the better of me, and I knocked, half hoping he wouldn't answer. To my surprise, the door creaked open. He stood there, smiling as always, but behind him, I could see the dimly lit interior of his apartment. It was cluttered, with stacks of papers, boxes, and random items scattered everywhere, nothing out of the ordinary for an old man living alone. But there was something about the air inside, thick and suffocating, that made me uneasy. "Can I help you with something, dear?" he asked, his voice gentle and calm. I quickly made up an excuse about hearing noises the other night and just wanting to make sure everything was okay. He chuckled softly and waved it off, saying, "Oh, just my old bones creaking around. Nothing to worry about." I forced a smile, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the corner of a table near the door was an old, tattered photograph. It was of a young woman, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair and a serious expression. I didn't recognize her, and I found it odd because I had never heard him mention any family. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Who was she? Was she his daughter, a niece, maybe even a wife from his past? I decided I needed to know more, even though I wasn't sure why. Something about the whole situation was starting to feel wrong. A few days later, I saw an opportunity. Mr. Johnson had mentioned to me in passing that he was going to visit a friend in a nearby town and would be gone for the afternoon. I felt guilty even thinking about it, but my curiosity was eating away at me. So, when he left, I made up my mind. I was going to sneak into his apartment and see if I could find out more about who he really was. I know it was a terrible idea, but I convinced myself it was harmless. I would just peek around, look for some clues, and leave before he got back. No harm done, right? I waited until I was sure he was gone, then quietly let myself into his apartment. The place smelled even worse than I remembered, stale, like a mixture of mold and chemicals. I carefully stepped over the piles of junk, making my way deeper into the apartment. As I looked around, I started to notice things that didn't add up. There were stacks of newspapers, some dating back over 30 years. Random objects that seemed out of place: old shoes, broken lamps, a cracked mirror. It looked more like a hoarder's den than a home. But then, I found something that made my heart stop. In the back room, hidden under a pile of dusty blankets, was a door. It was locked, but the key was sitting on a nearby table. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and slowly pushed it open. Inside, I found a small room, dark and cold. And there, in the middle of the floor, was a large metal table. On it were various tools: knives, pliers, ropes, all laid out meticulously. And on the wall, covering almost every inch, were photographs. Hundreds of them. All of the same woman from the photograph I had seen before. But they weren't just photos. Some were torn, with angry scribbles drawn across them. Others were taped together like some kind of twisted collage. My stomach churned as I realized that these weren't just random pictures. They were surveillance photos taken from different angles, at different times, showing the woman in her everyday life. Walking down the street, sitting at a cafe, shopping. And then, the last few photos showed her standing outside my apartment building. I froze. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this woman someone who had lived here before me? Why was she in all these photos, and why did Mr. Johnson have them? Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. My blood ran cold. I quickly shut the door to the room, locked it, and scrambled out of the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped back into my own apartment, I heard the creak of Mr. Johnson's door opening upstairs. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, listening to every creak, every shuffle of footsteps from above. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something dark, something dangerous. The next morning, I went to the police. I told them everything I had found, though part of me felt insane even as I said it out loud. But when they went to check Mr. Johnson's apartment, he was gone. The place had been emptied out, cleaned as if no one had lived there in years. To this day, I have no idea where he went or who that woman was. But I can't help but wonder if I had been living next door to someone far more dangerous than I ever could have imagined. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear those strange noises coming from the empty apartment above.